The sky was the color of steel, heavy and merciless. The snow did not fall softly that night. It slashed sideways, carried by winds that howled like wolves through the narrow valley. It was the kind of cold that burned the skin, the kind of cold that could freeze a river solid overnight. And in that brutal winter, when the thermometer read -20 degrees Celsius, a young woman stood trembling on the edge of an ice-covered lake, her breath rising in frantic clouds. Her name was Valentina Carter. 7 months pregnant, her belly curved beneath her thin wool coat, a coat far too fragile for a night like this. She clutched it shut with both hands, as if holding herself together could keep out the cold. Her face was pale, lips cracked, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Behind her stood her husband, Richard Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, his voice sharp as the wind that cut across the frozen water. "Get in," he barked. "Show me you're not useless. Prove you can still obey." The words sliced deeper than the cold. Valentina's heart pounded against her ribs. Her unborn child kicked inside her, as if begging her not to take another step. She shook her head, desperate tears freezing against her lashes. "Richard, please," she whispered. I can't. The baby." But Richard's hand clamped down on her shoulder, his grip iron, his eyes blazing with anger and pride. "Don't use that baby as an excuse. You think you're fragile? You're not. Get in the water, Valentina, now." The small crowd that had gathered on the snowy bank gasped. They had seen arguments before, married couples clashing in the bitter winters of their little town, but this was different. This was cruelty unfolding in the open, cruelty directed at a woman who was visibly vulnerable. Among the onlookers was David Collins, the town's only doctor. His jaw tightened as he stepped forward. "Richard, stop this madness," he shouted over the wind. "She's pregnant. You'll kill her and the baby." But Richard only sneered. "Mind your own business, doctor. My wife belongs to me. She'll do as I say." Valentina's legs shook, her boots slipping slightly on the ice. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt locked in place by fear and exhaustion. This was not the man she thought she had married. The Richard she fell in love with once made her laugh with silly jokes, once kissed her hands when she cried after work, once promised to protect her no matter what. That man was gone, replaced by someone colder than the winter night itself. The villagers whispered, their voices trembling with disbelief. "He's gone too far," an old woman muttered. "Forcing her into the lake in this weather, with child?" But no one dared step closer. Richard was powerful in his arrogance, and fear of him hung in the air. Valentina's tears turned into tiny crystals on her cheeks. She looked at Richard, hoping to find even the smallest trace of mercy, but saw none. His eyes were locked on her with cruel expectation, as if her obedience was a stage for his pride. And then it struck her. This wasn't just about control. This was about humiliation. Richard wanted the world to see her as weak, desperate, and broken. The ice beneath her cracked faintly, a sound sharp as glass. Panic rushed through her veins. She turned back to him, her voice breaking. "Richard, I'm begging you. Please. If not for me, then for our child." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Our child? Do you think that baby will save you? Get in, Valentina." For a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind paused, as if nature itself was watching. Then with a shove, Richard forced her forward. Valentina's cry pierced the night as her body plunged through the thin layer of ice into the black, freezing water below. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some women screamed. David rushed forward, but Richard blocked him with a raised arm. "She'll survive," Richard said coldly. "She needs to learn her place." Under the ice, the cold slammed into Valentina like 1,000 knives. Her lungs seized, her body convulsed. She clawed her way upward, her hands bloody from the jagged ice as she tried to break through the surface. Her baby shifted violently inside her belly, and terror gripped her heart. Would this be the end for both of them? David shouted again, his voice raw. "She's drowning! Get her out now!" For a terrifying moment, no one moved. The crowd stood frozen, paralyzed by the horror of what they were witnessing. Richard's shadow loomed over the broken ice, his face unreadable. He had wanted to see fear, and now he saw it in its purest form. But instead of reaching down to save her, he folded his arms. And then, with one final desperate strike, Valentina broke the surface, gasping for air, her fingers clinging to the sharp rim of the ice hole. Her sobs tore through the night. The doctor threw off his coat. pushing past Richard, diving to his knees, and hauling her out with every ounce of his strength. She collapsed into his arms, shivering violently, her lips blue, her breath shallow. The villagers surged forward now, outrage replacing their fear. He could have killed her. A pregnant woman, for God's sake. Richard Carter, you're a monster. But Richard didn't flinch. He simply smirked at his wife lying in another man's arms. If she can't handle a little cold, maybe she's not strong enough to be my wife. That single sentence hung in the air like poison. It was the moment everything shattered. The trust, the love, the illusion of safety. Valentina's heart cracked open as the truth burned in her chest. This man would never protect her. This man would rather watch her die than give her kindness. And as David carried her away through the snow, wrapping his own coat tightly around her trembling body, Valentina knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night would change everything. Because sometimes, survival itself is the first act of rebellion. And tonight, Valentina survived. She would never belong to Richard Carter again. Before the freezing night that would scar her forever. Valentina Carter was known as the kind of woman people in town trusted without hesitation. She wasn't glamorous or wealthy, not the kind of person who drew attention when she entered a room. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind that made children smile and elders feel respected. At 28, Valentina worked as a schoolteacher in the small mountain town of Grayford. Her classroom was a modest one, with cracked chalkboards and desks that bore decades of carved initials. Yet to her, it was a sacred place. She taught her students not only how to read and write, but also how to believe in themselves. When a boy came to class with holes in his shoes, she would secretly slip a pair of warm socks into his backpack. When a girl struggled with arithmetic, she would stay long after the bell rang, patiently guiding her through numbers until the tears disappeared from the child's eyes. Her salary barely covered rent and groceries, yet she gave more of herself than anyone else could see. That was who Valentina was, someone who poured love into every crack the world left behind. And when she met Richard Carter, she believed she had found someone who would finally pour love back into her. Richard was everything she thought she wanted in a man. Charming, ambitious, confident. He swept her off her feet quickly, promising her a life of security after years of struggling. They married within a year. She had been so certain she was stepping into a partnership built on respect. What she didn't know was that her vow would be the start of her undoing. At first, life with Richard wasn't unbearable. He liked to show her off when they went into town, bragging about how lucky he was to marry such a beautiful schoolteacher. He would kiss her cheek in public and call her his sweet Val. But behind closed doors, his words often carried sharp edges. "You don't understand real ambition," he would scoff when she asked about his late nights. "You're too soft, Valentina. That's why people walk all over you. Do you even know how hard it is for me to carry this family while you waste your time teaching brats for pennies?" Each comment chipped away at her confidence, but Valentina stayed silent. She told herself he was under pressure, that he would change once the baby arrived, that his cruelty was only temporary. She clung to the memory of the man she had first loved, the one who used to bring her wildflowers after work. Then came the pregnancy. When Valentina discovered she was expecting, her heart swelled with hope. She imagined the baby as the glue that might hold their marriage together, the miracle that would soften Richard's temper. She decorated the tiny nursery with second-hand furniture, painting the crib by herself until her hands blistered. She sewed little blankets late at night, humming lullabies her mother used to sing. But instead of tender joy, Richard grew colder. He complained about the cost of baby supplies, mocked her morning sickness, and accused her of using pregnancy as an excuse to rest. "Don't think you get a free pass just because you're carrying a baby," he said one morning, slamming his coffee cup down. She never argued. Instead, she carried the weight of his words alone, burying her pain under gentle smiles whenever neighbors asked how she was doing. What people didn't see was the depth of Valentina's loneliness. Her parents had died years earlier in a car accident, and she had no siblings to lean on. Richard was supposed to be her family, her protector. Instead, he became her tormentor. Still, she kept going. Every day she walked to school, despite the icy roads, her breath fogging in the air, her swollen belly slowing her steps. Her students became her anchor. Their laughter reminded her that kindness still mattered, even if her own home was filled with cold silence. At night, she would press her hands against her belly and whisper, "I'll keep you safe, I promise." It was a vow spoken in the dark, a vow she prayed she could keep even when Richard's anger grew unpredictable. One evening, after she prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, Richard arrived home with the faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked about it, his laugh was cruel. "Don't start, Valentina. You're not exactly irresistible these days." Her heart sank, but she said nothing. She simply cleared the table, washed the dishes, and tucked herself into bed with tears she didn't let him see. She had heard whispers in town about Vanessa Moore, the wealthy daughter of a businessman who often lingered around Richard. But Valentina forced herself to believe they were only rumors. She told herself that if she endured a little longer, everything would get better. What she didn't realize was that her silence was giving Richard more power. By the time winter tightened its icy grip on Grayford, Richard had grown reckless with his cruelty. He would criticize her in front of neighbors, call her weak, laugh at her struggles. Still, she endured, because she believed walking away wasn't an option. She thought she had nowhere to go. But fate has a way of testing those who suffer quietly. And Valentina's test came the night Richard led her to the frozen lake, demanding she step into the water. In that moment, everything about her life, the sacrifices, the heartbreak, the silent prayers, collided with brutal clarity. She was no longer just a wife, she was a mother fighting for her child. And though she survived that night, shivering in the arms of David Collins, a truth began to spark deep inside her. Endurance was no longer enough. For the first time in her life, Valentina realized she would have to choose between obedience and survival. And survival meant walking away. She had no idea that leaving Richard would not only save her life, but also uncover secrets that would change everything. Grayford was not the kind of town people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It sat nestled in a narrow valley, hemmed in by towering pine-covered mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. The winters here were legendary, brutal enough to test even the strongest souls. Roads disappeared under feet of snow, roofs groaned under white weight, and the river froze so hard that children could skate across it without fear of breaking through. But beneath the quiet beauty of snow-laden branches and icicle-tipped eaves, Grayford carried something darker, a silence that smothered those who lived there. Everyone knew everyone, and yet, when pain unfolded behind closed doors, people turned away. For Valentina, that silence was both a curse and a prison. She had arrived in Grayford with Richard shortly after their wedding. He had inherited a small cabin from his uncle, perched at the edge of town, where the forest pressed close against the back door. At first, Valentina thought it was charming. Rustic wood beams, a stone fireplace, windows that looked out on endless pines. But as the years passed, the charm faded, replaced by isolation. The cabin was far enough from town that no one could hear if she cried. Grayford's people prided themselves on resilience. They had survived generations of punishing winters, working the mines, logging the forests, and scraping what they could from the frozen earth. Poverty was common, but pride was stronger. Men were judged by their toughness, women by their obedience. And in that harsh code of survival, marriage was sacred, no matter how broken it became. Neighbors whispered about Richard's temper, of course. They saw the way he barked orders at Valentina in the market, the way she flinched when his hand moved too quickly. But they said nothing. In Grayford, interfering in another man's home was considered a betrayal of unwritten rules. "A wife belongs to her husband," the old man muttered around the wood stove at the general store. "She chose him. Now she must endure him." And so the community became complicit. They turned their heads, convincing themselves that what happened inside the Carter cabin was none of their concern. The winter of Valentina's pregnancy was one of the worst the town had seen in decades. Temperatures plunged to -20, sometimes colder. The roads became sheets of glass. Families huddled close to wood stoves, rationing supplies, waiting for spring to bring relief. But inside Valentina's cabin, the cold was more than physical. It seeped into her marriage, freezing out what little warmth had once existed. Each night Richard came home later, often with the scent of whiskey or a trace of perfume lingering on his coat. Each morning he left with harsh words, demanding she chop more wood, shovel the path, or clean until her swollen belly ached. He did not see her as a wife carrying his child. He saw her as a burden, one he had no patience for. The cabin became a cage, and yet Valentina endured, because Greyford offered her nowhere else to go. The town was small, opportunities scarce. She had no living family, no savings, no safety net. Walking away from Richard felt like stepping into a storm without shelter. Still, there were small glimmers of kindness in Greyford, though fragile as candlelight in the wind. David Collins, the town's doctor, often stopped by to check on her under the guise of routine care. He brought her extra vitamins, warm tea, and books for her students. His presence was a reminder that not everyone in Greyford was blind. But even he tread carefully. Confronting Richard meant provoking a man known for his pride and violence. Valentina would stand by the frost-covered window at night, watching the town's faint lights flicker in the distance. She imagined the lives unfolding behind those windows, families gathered around fireplaces, children laughing, couples sharing quiet meals. And then she would look at her own reflection in the glass, pale and weary, and whisper to her unborn child, "One day, we'll be free. I promise." The environment of Greyford magnified everything she suffered. The endless snowstorms mirrored her isolation. The biting winds carried the sting of Richard's words. The frozen river was a cruel metaphor for her life. Trapped under ice, suffocating, desperate for air. It was in this town, under the gaze of silent neighbors and unforgiving mountains, that the unthinkable night at the lake occurred. The setting itself seemed to conspire against her, holding her in place until Richard's cruelty spilled into the open. But Greyford was also a place where secrets could not stay buried forever. Gossip traveled faster than snowmelt in spring, and after that night, whispers about Richard's actions spread through the community like wildfire. Some villagers said Valentina would not survive. Others whispered that the baby was surely lost. Still others murmured that perhaps Richard had gone too far this time, that perhaps Greyford's silence had allowed a monster to grow unchecked. The town that once ignored her pain now found itself haunted by it. And as Valentina lay recovering under David's care, wrapped in blankets, her lips trembling from fever, a storm raged both outside and within. The cabin she once called home no longer existed in her heart. The mountains no longer looked like guardians, they looked like prison walls. Greyford had taken much from her. But it would also be the stage where she reclaimed everything Richard thought he had stolen. Because deep in the valley, where whispers grew louder than the wind, Valentina's story was no longer just hers. It was a mirror for every silent woman watching, waiting, and hoping for the courage to break free. And Richard, proud and arrogant, had no idea that the very town that once protected his silence would soon turn against him. What he did not know was that Valentina's suffering had already planted the seeds of her transformation, and the mountains of Greyford would one day echo not with her cries, but with his downfall. Richard Carter had always been a man who believed he deserved more than what life had given him. In a small mountain town like Greyford, most men were content with a steady job, a warm home, and a family to carry their name. But Richard was not most men. From the time he was a teenager, he dreamed of power, wealth, and recognition. He wanted to be admired, feared, respected, not just another face in the crowd. At 32, Richard cut a striking figure. Tall, broad, with dark hair slicked neatly back, he had the kind of presence that filled a room before he spoke. He knew how to charm when he needed to, how to use his confident smile to win over townsfolk at the bar, or to convince a businessman to trust him with a deal. But behind that smile lay something colder, a hunger that no amount of money or affection could satisfy. For a while, Valentina had believed she was part of his dream. When they first met, Richard had showered her with compliments, telling her she was too good for this small life, that together they would rise above the limitations of Greyford. He promised her stability, a future free from struggle. Valentina, weary from years of surviving alone, wanted to believe him. But Richard's definition of love was control. As soon as the wedding vows were spoken, his mask began to slip. He mocked her modest salary as a teacher, dismissing her job as babysitting. He belittled her simple joys, her books, her knitting, her quiet afternoons. Where she saw meaning, he saw weakness. And when she became pregnant, instead of softening, he grew harsher. To Richard, her pregnancy was not a miracle but a chain. It tied him down to responsibility when what he craved was freedom and status. That was when Vanessa Moore entered the picture. Vanessa was everything Richard thought he wanted. At 26, she was wealthy, bold, and unapologetically ambitious. The daughter of a successful businessman, Vanessa was used to luxury. Silk dresses, glittering jewelry, the hum of expensive cars waiting outside restaurants. She represented the life Richard felt he deserved, not the humble cabin and modest wife he had chosen. The affair began discreetly. Vanessa would invite him to dinners in the city, whispering promises of connections and opportunities. She flattered his ego, telling him he was destined for greatness, that Valentina was holding him back. Richard drank in her words like wine. Each time he returned home smelling faintly of her perfume, his contempt for his wife grew sharper. "You'll never understand what it means to be powerful," he told Valentina one night, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too small, too ordinary." Valentina lowered her gaze, hiding the tears threatening to spill. She didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on her belly, protecting the child inside. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. With Vanessa's influence, his arrogance swelled. He strutted through town with a confidence that bordered on cruelty. At the tavern, he bragged about business ventures that hadn't yet succeeded. At the market, he treated Valentina like an accessory, snapping at her in front of others. Neighbors noticed, but fear and tradition kept them quiet. Vanessa fueled the fire. "If you want to rise," she whispered, her manicured hand resting on his arm, "you need to rid yourself of dead weight. A man like you doesn't belong with a timid schoolteacher. You belong with someone who can match your ambition." Those words became poison in his mind. Soon, every glance at Valentina felt like a reminder of his own limitations. Instead of seeing her sacrifices, he saw chains. Instead of seeing her devotion, he saw weakness. And with every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, he convinced himself he was justified. By the time winter descended on Grayford, Richard was no longer hiding his disdain. He spoke openly of Vanessa, though not by name, boasting of new opportunities and important people who valued him. He compared Valentina to her, though she didn't know it, saying things like, "Some women know how to be strong. You could learn from them. But cruelty, like ice, has a way of spreading until it cracks the ground beneath it." The night at the frozen lake was not born out of sudden rage. It was the culmination of months of contempt, of a man intoxicated by the belief that he could do anything, that he owned the woman carrying his child. For Richard, forcing Valentina into the icy water was not just punishment, it was performance. It was proof to himself, to Vanessa, and to anyone watching that he was in control, that even nature's fury bowed to his will. What Richard did not anticipate was the reaction of the town. In Grayford, cruelty had always hidden behind walls, but when he pushed his pregnant wife into the freezing lake, he dragged his violence into the open. The villagers who once stayed silent began to whisper. The doctor who once tread carefully now stood against him, and Vanessa, watching from the shadows, began to see not just a man of ambition, but a man unraveling. Yet Richard did not see his downfall coming. That night, after David pulled Valentina from the water, Richard returned home without her. He poured himself a drink by the fire, convinced that she would come crawling back, desperate and broken. He smirked at the thought of her shivering, believing she had no one else to turn to. In his mind, he was still the master of her fate. But what he didn't know was that Valentina was no longer his to control. The woman he had tried to destroy was already beginning to find strength he had never imagined. And the very community that once protected his silence would soon witness his downfall. Richard Carter believed he had everything: power over his wife, the attention of Vanessa, the respect of the town. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the cracks forming beneath their feet. And when those cracks finally broke, Richard would discover what it felt like to be the one drowning. Because while he saw Valentina as weak, she was already preparing to rise stronger than he ever could. The night of the frozen lake would be remembered in Grayford for decades. Long after the snow melted and the river thawed, people would still whisper about what Richard Carter did to his pregnant wife. It began with a gathering. The townsfolk had come together for the winter festival, a tradition as old as Grayford itself. Every year, families bundled in layers of wool and fur gathered by the lake to light lanterns, drink hot cider, and share stories while the children skated on the thick sheet of ice. It was a celebration of survival, a reminder that even in the coldest season, life endured. Valentina arrived reluctantly, her steps slow on the snow-packed ground. At 7 months pregnant, she should have been resting, but Richard insisted she come. "People need to see us," he said sharply when she hesitated. "I won't have them whispering that my wife is too weak to leave the cabin." She obeyed, as she always had, though her heart pounded with dread. Wrapped in a thin coat, she walked beside him, her breath visible in the night air. Around her, lanterns glowed, laughter echoed, and music drifted from fiddles near the bonfire. But all she felt was the weight of Richard's hand gripping her arm like a shackle. At first, everything seemed normal. Couples twirled on the ice, children tossed snow at one another, and the townsfolk gathered in circles, exchanging news. Richard moved from group to group, flashing his charming smile, speaking loudly about opportunities in the city. He relished the attention, especially when Vanessa Moore appeared, draped in a fur-lined coat that glistened under the lanterns. Her presence made Valentina's stomach twist. Though Richard hadn't admitted the affair, Valentina could feel it in her bones. The way Vanessa's eyes lingered on him, the way Richard's voice softened when he spoke to her, it was enough to carve pain into Valentina's heart. Then, as if the night itself demanded cruelty, Richard raised his voice so all could hear. "My wife," he said, his arm tightening around Valentina's shoulder. "She's been pampered too long. People think she's fragile, but I know better. Tonight, she'll prove her strength." The crowd quieted, curious. Valentina froze. She could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her, waiting. Richard gestured toward the lake, where the surface shimmered under the moonlight. "Valentina will show everyone that she is not weak. She will step into the water, even at 20 below, and she will endure. That's what it means to be my wife." Gasps spread through the crowd. A murmur rose, disbelief crackling in the air. "She's pregnant." Someone whispered, "Surely he's joking," another muttered. But Richard's eyes were cold, his jaw set. He wasn't joking. Valentina's heart thudded in her chest. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't. The baby." He cut her off, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The baby is fine. Stop using it as an excuse. Step onto the ice, Valentina. Show them you are worthy." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The fire crackled in the distance, the fiddles stopped, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, slowly, Richard shoved her forward. Valentina stumbled toward the lake, her boots slipping on the hard-packed snow. She shook her head desperately, tears freezing on her lashes. "Don't make me do this." But his hand pressed against her back, unyielding. "Do it," he hissed, "or prove to everyone you're nothing but a weak, pathetic burden." The crowd erupted. Some pleaded, "Richard, stop." Others covered their mouths in horror. But no one stepped forward. Grayford's unspoken rule, that a wife belonged to her husband, held them back, paralyzing them in the face of cruelty. Only David Collins, the doctor, broke through the line. "Enough," he shouted, his breath steaming in the cold. "She's carrying a child, Richard. You'll kill them both." Richard turned on him, his glare sharp as a blade. "Stay out of this, Collins. You're nothing but a busybody doctor. This is my wife. She does as I say." The villagers murmured nervously, torn between outrage and fear. David clenched his fists but held his ground, his eyes locked on Valentina's trembling figure, silently willing her to hold on. And then it happened. With a sudden brutal shove, Richard pushed her onto the ice. She landed with a cry, her knees scraping against the frozen surface. Pain shot through her belly, and terror gripped her as the baby shifted violently inside. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape, but Richard was already behind her. "Go on," he sneered. "Prove yourself." The ice cracked beneath her boots, a sharp sound that silenced the crowd. Her breath came in frantic gasps. She shook her head, begging, but Richard's eyes burned with merciless pride. And then he shoved her again. The surface gave way. The lake swallowed her whole. The crowd screamed. Gasps filled the night air as the freezing black water closed over Valentina's body. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the wind and the muffled thuds of her hands pounding against the ice from below. David lunged forward, sprinting onto the ice. "Hold on, Valentina," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The villagers rushed closer, panic spreading like wildfire. Some cried out in horror, others covered their children's eyes. But Richard stood still, arms crossed, watching as if it were a test of endurance rather than a fight for survival. Under the water, Valentina's lungs burned. The cold pierced her like 1,000 knives. She clawed upward, searching for air, her hands bloodying against the jagged ice. The baby inside her twisted violently as if fighting alongside her. In her mind, one thought echoed, "I can't die. I won't let him take both of us." David reached her just as her strength was failing. Slamming his fists against the ice, he broke through, plunging his arms into the freezing water. "Valentina, take my hand," he cried. Her fingers found his, weak and trembling, and with a roar of effort, he pulled her out, dragging her onto the ice. She collapsed against him, her lips blue, her body shivering uncontrollably. The villagers crowded around now, outrage spilling over their fear. She could have died. She's carrying his child. This is madness. But Richard only smirked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If she can't survive a little cold, maybe she doesn't deserve to be my wife." The words landed like a slap across the entire town. For the first time, Grayford saw Richard not as a man of ambition, but as a monster. And as David wrapped his coat around Valentina and carried her away from the lake, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same. Because that night, Richard Carter didn't just humiliate his wife. He humiliated himself. And Grayford would never forget. When David Collins carried Valentina away from the frozen lake, the crowd slowly dispersed, whispering in shock. Some shook their heads, others cursed Richard under their breath. But by the time Valentina was brought into David's home, wrapped in blankets and trembling violently, Grayford had returned to its silence. No one dared confront Richard directly. No one wanted to be the one who broke the town's unwritten rules. Valentina's body was ice. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as snow. David laid her gently on a couch near the fire, his hands moving quickly, almost frantically. He stripped away her soaked coat and boots, replaced them with dry blankets, and pressed hot compresses to her shivering arms. "Stay with me, Valentina," he urged, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "Don't close your eyes. You have to fight." Her teeth chattered violently, her breath shallow. "The baby," she whispered. Her hand clutched her belly as if shielding the child from death itself. "Please, save the baby." David swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in his throat. He was a doctor, trained to act, but in that moment he was also a man watching cruelty he could hardly comprehend. "I will," he promised softly. "But you have to save yourself first." The hours that followed blurred into a haze of fever and fear. Valentina's body burned with chills so severe her bones seemed to shake against each other. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes crying out in confusion. At one point, her eyes fluttered open and she whispered, "Mama? Are you here?" Her late mother's face appeared in her fevered dreams, standing at the edge of the room, whispering lullabies from Valentina's childhood. She reached out weakly, her hand trembling in the air, but touched only emptiness. David never left her side. He changed the compresses, measured her pulse, and checked the baby's heartbeat with trembling relief each time he heard its steady rhythm. Still, he knew the danger was not over. Hypothermia and pregnancy were a cruel combination. One wrong turn, and they could lose both mother and child. As night bled into morning, Valentina stirred awake with a ragged gasp. The fever had painted her cheeks crimson, her hair plastered damply to her forehead. Her voice was hoarse, almost broken. "Why, David? Why would he do this to me?" David's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her the truth, that Richard was a coward, a man who valued pride over love, but instead he said gently, "Because he doesn't see what you're worth, but I do, and so will others, once you find the strength to leave him." Tears welled in her eyes. "Leave? I have nothing. No money, no family. Where would I go? Who would take in a pregnant woman?" Her voice cracked with despair. I thought a husband was supposed to protect his wife." She turned her face into the pillow, sobs shaking her frail body. Every tear felt like it carved a scar deeper inside her. For the next several days, she lingered between sickness and exhaustion. David insisted she stay under his care, refusing to let her return to the cabin where Richard waited. When Richard came pounding on the door, demanding his wife back, David met him on the porch with steel in his voice. "She's not leaving this house until she's well," he said firmly. "And if you care about her child, you'll leave her be." Richard's glare burned hot enough to melt ice, but David stood his ground until he turned away. Still, Richard's threats lingered in the air like smoke. Inside, Valentina curled deeper into the blankets, her hands pressed protectively against her belly. The fever finally began to break, but the damage lingered in her spirit. She stared into the fire for hours, hollow-eyed, her thoughts circling endlessly. What if she lost the baby? What if Richard returned stronger and crueler? What if there was truly no escape? Her dreams turned dark. In one, she saw herself sinking beneath the ice again, unable to breathe, while Richard watched from the shore with folded arms. In another, she walked into the cabin only to find Vanessa seated in her chair, her hand on Richard's arm, her laughter echoing while Valentina was erased from existence. Each time she woke with a gasp, her chest heaving, she whispered, "I can't do this anymore." One evening, as snow tapped softly against the windows, Valentina sat upright on the couch, her face pale but her eyes burning with something different, fear mixed with determination. David was preparing tea when she finally spoke. "I can't go back to him," she whispered, almost as if she feared the walls would carry the confession to Richard's ears. David set the teapot down slowly. "Then don't." Her eyes filled with tears again. "It's not that simple. He'll find me, he'll take the baby. Her voice broke. "He'll finish what he started." David knelt in front of her, his voice steady. "Not if you fight back. You are stronger than you think, Valentina. He tried to drown you, but you're still here. That means something. That means you were meant to survive." His words pierced through the fog of despair, but fear still wrapped around her like chains. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I don't know how." David took her trembling hand in his. "Then let me help you. You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to take the first step." Valentina stared at their joined hands, something flickering faintly in her chest, something that felt like hope, though fragile and small. But that fragile spark was nearly extinguished the next day. While David went to fetch medicine from the clinic, Valentina heard footsteps outside. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The door rattled violently, then Richard's voice thundered through the walls. "Valentina, open this door. You're my wife, and you belong to me." Her hands clutched her belly as fear consumed her. He had come for her, just as she feared. And this time, she wasn't sure David would return before Richard forced his way in. The fire cracked loudly in the hearth as the pounding on the door grew harder. Valentina's heart raced. Her body was still weak, her fever barely gone. She knew if Richard dragged her back, she might never escape again. And then his voice came again, colder, sharper. "If you don't open this door, I swear, I'll make sure you regret it. You and that baby both." Valentina's breath hitched. She looked toward the window, toward the swirling snow outside. Every instinct screamed that she had only seconds to decide. Would she cower and let him drag her back into the cage? Or would she finally find the strength to resist? The pounding on David's door stopped only when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the snow. A few neighbors, hearing Richard's shouts, had wandered close enough to make their presence known. Richard cursed under his breath, his pride unwilling to create another scandal so soon after the lake incident. He left with a final growl, his words lingering like smoke. "This isn't over." Inside, Valentina collapsed onto the couch, clutching her belly, tears streaking down her pale cheeks. Her body was weak, but her spirit was even weaker. She whispered to herself, rocking slightly, "He'll never let me go. I'm trapped." When David returned later that evening with medicine, he found her trembling, her eyes red and swollen. He crouched down in front of her, concern etched across his face. "Valentina, listen to me. You are not trapped. There's something you don't know." Her gaze flickered toward him, filled with confusion and desperation. "What do you mean?" "I have nothing, David. No money, no family, nowhere to go. He knows that. That's why he keeps me." David hesitated for a long moment, as though weighing the burden of what he was about to say. Then, with a steady breath, he revealed the truth. You're wrong. You're not alone, and you're not without resources. Your mother, she left you something. Valentina blinked, stunned. For a moment she thought she'd misheard him. My mother? But she died years ago. She had nothing, David. Just a small cottage, barely enough to keep us alive. David shook his head. That's what she wanted you to believe. But the truth is different. Before she passed, she came to me. She asked me to hold documents for you, to give them to you only when you truly needed them. I believe that time is now. Her heart pounded. Documents? What kind of documents? David stood and crossed the room to his desk. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a weathered envelope, its edges worn with time. He brought it to her, placing it gently into her trembling hands. Open it. With shaky fingers, Valentina tore the seal. Inside were several papers, yellowed but carefully kept. Her eyes widened as she read. A deed, bank statements, a will. Her mother's will. The words swam before her eyes, difficult to comprehend through her shock. Her mother had left her not only the cottage she grew up in, but also a parcel of land just outside Grayford. Land her mother had quietly inherited from her own parents. Land that had recently risen in value because of development nearby. And in a bank account, untouched for years, sat a sum of money larger than anything Valentina had ever seen. Not millions, but enough to free her. Enough to build a life away from Richard. Enough to protect her baby. Her lips parted in disbelief. This can't be real. Why didn't she tell me? David's voice softened. She wanted to protect you. She worried that if Richard, or any man like him, knew about it, they'd use it against you. She told me to wait until the moment you had no other choice, until the moment you needed strength. Valentina's hands shook as tears blurred her vision. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on her chest lifted, if only slightly. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't penniless. She wasn't trapped. She had a way out. But as the flicker of hope began to warm her, fear returned just as quickly. Richard, if he finds out about this, he'll take it. He'll use it against me. He'll never let me leave. David's eyes hardened. Then we don't let him find out. You don't tell him. Not yet. You take this gift your mother left you, and you use it to free yourself. Valentina, this is your chance. This is your way out. Her breath trembled as she clutched the documents to her chest. A storm of emotions swirled inside her. Grief for the mother she missed so dearly, anger at Richard for everything he had stolen from her, fear of what might come next, and beneath it all, a growing ember of strength she thought she had lost forever. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake on the couch, staring into the fire, replaying David's words in her mind. Your mother left you strength. This is your way out. For the first time, she dared to imagine a different future. A small home filled with warmth where no one raised their voice at her. A life where she taught again, where she raised her child in peace. A world where she wasn't owned by anyone, but free. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. But hope is fragile, and danger lurked just outside the door. Because while Valentina whispered prayers of gratitude to her mother, Richard was already scheming. Vanessa had cornered him the day after the lake incident, her lips curling in disdain. You looked like a fool, Richard, she hissed. The whole town is whispering about you. If you can't control your wife without humiliating yourself, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. Richard's pride burned like fire. In his arrogance, he swore he would not lose face. He convinced himself Valentina would come crawling back, that she had nowhere else to go. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. And men like Richard, when cornered, became dangerous. The next morning, while Valentina clutched her mother's will like a lifeline, Richard stood outside the Carter cabin, staring at the snow-covered roof. He lit a cigarette, his jaw clenched. If she thinks she can defy me, he muttered, smoke curling in the cold air, she has another thing coming. Back at David's house, Valentina finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her hand resting protectively on her belly. In her dreams, she heard her mother's voice again. Strength, my child, I left you strength. She woke with tears streaming down her face, but this time they weren't only tears of sorrow, they were tears of resolve. Her life had been built on silence and endurance. But now, with her mother's secret inheritance, she held the key to a different destiny. Still, fear lingered. Richard was unpredictable, and Vanessa's poisonous whispers only fed his rage. Valentina knew that if he ever discovered the truth about the inheritance, he would destroy her before letting her go. She pressed the papers to her chest, her heart pounding. For the first time, she had hope. For the first time, she had power. But power in secret is a dangerous thing. And as the wind howled outside David's window, Valentina could not shake the feeling that Richard was already moving closer, already plotting his next act of cruelty. She had strength now, but was it enough to survive the storm about to come? For days, Valentina held the papers close, rereading her mother's will and bank statements over and over, as if the words might vanish if she blinked too long. Each time she felt the same dizzying mix of disbelief and relief. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't trapped. There was a future waiting for her. A future Richard could no longer control. But knowing she had strength and learning to use it were two very different things. At first, she remained cautious, hiding the inheritance as if even the walls might betray her secret. She tucked the envelope under the floorboard in David's study, where Richard's eyes could never find it. Each night she whispered to her unborn child, "We have hope now. We will be free." Her body slowly recovered from the shock of the icy lake. The fever faded, her strength returned, and with it came something unexpected. A fire. Each morning as she washed her face and looked into the mirror, she no longer saw only fear staring back. She saw someone who had survived what should have killed her. She saw a woman who had endured humiliation, pain, and betrayal, and was still standing. It began with small changes. She brushed her hair differently, tying it back with purpose instead of letting it hang limply around her shoulders. She walked with straighter posture, her hand resting on her belly with pride rather than shame. She began to speak more, not in whispers, but in steady words. David noticed immediately. "You're different," he said one morning as he poured her a cup of tea. Valentina smiled faintly. "I'm tired of being silent." And then, one evening, she did something that surprised even herself. She left David's home alone and walked into Grayford. Heads turned as she entered the small tailor's shop. The townsfolk hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the scandal at the lake. Whispers buzzed like bees as she passed. Some pitied her, others judged her, but Valentina ignored them all. Inside the shop, she asked for a gown. Not a lavish one, but one that fit her changing body, one that made her feel like more than just the poor wife of Richard Carter. She chose a dark green fabric that clung softly to her figure, accentuating her strength instead of hiding it. When she saw herself in the mirror for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of pride. The transformation was not just in her clothing, it was in her eyes. The woman who had walked into that shop looked timid and broken. The woman who walked out looked like someone who carried secrets too heavy for the town to guess. Word spread quickly. "Did you see her? Valentina Carter, walking through town as if nothing had happened." She looked different, stronger. Richard's wife? No, she's not the same woman anymore. Richard himself soon heard the whispers. At first he laughed. "She's pretending," he scoffed to Vanessa. "She has nothing without me." But even he felt a twinge of unease. For the first time, the town wasn't whispering about his charm or ambition. They were whispering about her. Meanwhile, Valentina began to plan. She visited the bank in secret, escorted by David to avoid Richard's watchful eyes. There, the manager confirmed what the papers revealed. The money was real, the land was hers, and no one, not even Richard, could touch it. With David's help, she began to draft plans for her future. A new home, away from the cabin that had become her prison. A safe nursery for her child. And perhaps one day, a school of her own, where no child in Grayford would feel as powerless as she once had. But transformation is never without fear. At night, Richard's voice still echoed in her dreams, reminding her of the danger. She knew he would not give up easily. His pride was too great, his rage too deep. And so, she armored herself, not just with money and plans, but with courage. One afternoon, standing before the mirror in her new gown, she spoke aloud, not to Richard, but to herself. "You are not weak. You are not worthless. You are Valentina Carter, and you will never be his possession again." David heard her from the doorway, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "That's the woman I always knew you were." Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Invitations began to arrive, small gatherings, town meetings, places she had once been excluded from because Richard controlled the narrative. This time, she accepted. She attended with her head held high, speaking with quiet confidence, proving to the community that she was not the broken woman Richard wanted them to see. And slowly, the town began to shift. Whispers turned into support. People began to question Richard's cruelty, to murmur that perhaps they had been wrong to stay silent. It all built toward one night, the annual Winter Gala, the most prestigious event in Greyford. Richard planned to attend with Vanessa on his arm, expecting to parade her as proof of his power. But Valentina had other plans. The day before the gala, she stood before David, her green gown ready, her hair styled with careful grace. "I'm going," she said firmly. David frowned. "It's dangerous. Richard will be there. He'll try to humiliate you again." Her eyes burned with determination. "No. This time, I will humiliate him. I've hidden long enough. Tomorrow night, the whole town will see who Richard truly is, and they will see who I have become." David studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll be by your side." Valentina's heart raced with fear and anticipation. The gala would be her stage, the moment where she stepped fully into her new self. She no longer wanted just to survive, she wanted justice. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered once more to her unborn child, "Tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow we show the world we are not weak." But outside, in the icy streets of Greyford, Richard Carter was already planning his own performance. He boasted to Vanessa, "Tomorrow, she'll learn who really holds the power. She'll regret ever defying me." Neither of them knew that the gala would not end as either expected. Because in the glittering lights of that winter ballroom, truth would collide with arrogance, and the woman Richard thought he destroyed would rise from the ashes. And when Valentina walked through those doors, the entire town would finally see that the real power was hers. The night of the Winter Gala arrived like a storm, wrapped in velvet. Greyford's Grand Hall, normally used for town meetings and weddings, had been transformed into a glittering palace of light. Chandeliers dripped crystal tears onto polished wooden floors, while a string quartet filled the air with music that was both haunting and regal. The town's elite had gathered, wrapped in furs and silks, their laughter echoing beneath the high ceilings. It was the one night of the year when appearances mattered more than truth. And for Richard Carter, appearances were everything. He arrived with Vanessa Moore draped on his arm, her gown a bold scarlet that screamed defiance. She glittered with diamonds, her smile sharp as a knife. Richard, dressed in a black tailored suit, wore the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He paraded Vanessa through the hall, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, ignoring the whispers that still lingered from the scandal at the lake. "Look at him," one woman muttered to her husband, "as if nothing happened." "But people haven't forgotten," her husband replied grimly. "Not after what he did to Valentina." Yet Richard basked in the attention, convinced his charm was stronger than memory. He laughed loudly, boasted about business ventures, and whispered promises into Vanessa's ear. "Tonight, they'll forget all about her," he said. "Tonight, it's us they'll talk about." But then the doors opened, and Valentina walked in. The room fell silent, as if the music itself bowed to her entrance. She wore the deep green gown she had chosen, her hair swept elegantly back, her posture regal. Her hand rested gently on her swollen belly, not as a burden, but as a crown. She walked slowly, each step measured, her eyes forward, her expression calm and unshaken. She did not look like the broken woman who had fallen through the ice. She looked like a queen returning to reclaim her throne. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Is that Valentina? She looks radiant. She shouldn't even be here after what happened." Richard froze, his smirk faltering for the first time. His hand tightened on Vanessa's arm, but she felt it, his unease. He tried to cover it with a laugh. Well, the ghost returns," he muttered, forcing a grin. Valentina moved through the crowd, people parting for her without realizing it. She nodded politely, her eyes locking on Richard with quiet fire. When she reached the center of the hall, she paused, turning to face the crowd. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear, ringing against the marble walls. Every eye was on her. "I wasn't sure I would ever stand here again," she continued, But sometimes fate brings you back to the very place where you were broken, so you can show the world you were never truly destroyed. Murmurs spread. Richard's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "Valentina, that's enough," he snapped. "Go home. You're embarrassing yourself." But she didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "No, Richard. Tonight the only person embarrassing themselves is you." The crowd erupted in whispers, some gasping audibly. Richard stepped forward, trying to tower over her, but she held her ground. "You think you can humiliate me here?" he hissed. "You think these people care?" Valentina's lips curved into a faint smile. "I don't need to humiliate you, Richard. You did that yourself, when you pushed your pregnant wife into a frozen lake." The words rang like a bell, silencing the hall. All eyes turned to Richard. Gasps echoed. Vanessa's smile faltered, her fingers twitching nervously on his sleeve. Richard laughed weakly, though sweat glistened on his temple. "She's lying. She exaggerates. You all know how dramatic she is." But David Collins stepped forward from the crowd. "She's not lying. I pulled her out myself. I saw it. We all did." The room erupted. Shocked voices clashed like thunder. "It's true? He nearly killed her. A man like that has no honor." Richard's composure cracked. He raised his voice, desperate. "Enough. She's my wife. She belongs to me. What happens between us is no one else's business." But Valentina's voice rose higher, stronger. "I don't belong to you. Not anymore. I belong to myself, and to the child you tried to destroy." She reached into her purse, pulling out the documents her mother had left her. She held them high, her voice ringing with power. "And let the town know this. I am not penniless. I am not weak. I am the heir to land and wealth my mother entrusted to me. I am not the poor, broken woman you wanted me to be, Richard. I am free." The crowd gasped again, but this time it wasn't in pity, it was in awe. The broken wife they had pitied was gone. In her place stood a woman of strength, a woman with power. Richard's face twisted with rage. He lunged toward her, his hand outstretched as if to snatch the papers away. But before he could reach her, David stepped between them, his hand gripping Richard's wrist with iron strength. "Touch her again," David growled, "and I swear you'll regret it." The hall erupted into chaos. Some tried to calm the scene, others shouted in anger. Vanessa slipped quietly from Richard's side, her eyes wide with fear. The man she had admired now looked pathetic, cornered, undone. Valentina lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the storm. "This is who you are, Richard. A man who tries to break women because he is too weak to face himself. But tonight, everyone sees the truth." Richard's eyes blazed, his pride collapsing under the weight of humiliation. For the first time, he looked small, and as the crowd closed in around him, their whispers sharp as knives, Valentina turned and walked away, her gown trailing behind her like a banner of victory. But as she left the hall, one thought pierced her triumph like a shard of ice. Richard Carter was not a man who accepted defeat quietly, and she knew, deep in her bones, that his vengeance was only just beginning. The winter gala ended in chaos. By the time Valentina stepped outside into the cold night, the hall behind her buzzed with scandal. Richard Carter's name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with disgust. People who once turned away from his cruelty now whispered openly, "Monster. Coward. He doesn't deserve her." Valentina wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, the night air crisp but somehow no longer suffocating. For the first time in years, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. She had stood up to him, not in secret whispers or tears, but in front of everyone. And Grayford had seen the truth. But as she walked down the snowy street with David by her side, she knew Richard would not go quietly. His pride was too deep, his hunger for control too fierce. She was right. The very next morning, Richard stormed into the bank. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. He demanded to see Valentina's accounts, shouting about marital rights and property laws. But the bank manager, a man who had once cowered in his presence, calmly shook his head. "The accounts are in her name alone, Mr. Carter. You have no claim." Richard's rage boiled over. He smashed his fist onto the counter, shouting curses that echoed through the building. But it was useless. His power was crumbling. Word spread quickly. Within days, business partners began to distance themselves. Investors pulled out. Even Vanessa, sensing his collapse, vanished without a word. Richard found himself standing alone, his empire of arrogance dissolving like snow under the spring sun. Meanwhile, Valentina's life began to bloom. She used part of her inheritance to purchase a small but warm home near the heart of Greyford, far from the cabin that had imprisoned her. She filled it with light, fresh curtains, a crib painted in soft colors, shelves lined with children's books. For the first time, she could breathe without fear. When the baby finally came, a healthy, crying boy with dark hair and bright eyes, she wept tears of pure relief. She named him Gabriel, after the angel who brings messages of hope. Holding him against her chest, she whispered, "You'll never know the pain I knew. You'll grow in love, not fear." David stood by her side through it all, not as a savior, but as a steady presence, a reminder that not all men wielded love as a weapon. His support was quiet, never demanding, always respectful. And though Valentina's heart was still fragile, she began to imagine a life where trust and companionship could exist again. Not built on control, but on choice. The town, too, began to change. Greyford could no longer ignore what it had witnessed. Women whispered to Valentina in the market, thanking her for her courage, confessing their own silent struggles. Men who once looked down on her now nodded in respect. Children ran to her with laughter, asking when she would teach again. And she did. With part of her inheritance, Valentina opened a small schoolhouse, brighter and warmer than the old one where she had once taught. "For every child who needs a voice," she told the townsfolk at the ribbon cutting, "for every woman who thinks she has none." Her transformation became more than personal. It became a beacon. But Richard, stripped of wealth, respect, and love, spiraled deeper into bitterness. One cold morning, he stood outside Valentina's new school, watching from a distance as she carried Gabriel inside, surrounded by children and laughter. He looked gaunt, his once proud shoulders hunched. He shouted her name, demanding she speak to him. Valentina stepped outside, her son cradled in her arms. The townsfolk gathered, curious but wary. "What do you want, Richard?" Her voice was calm, steady, no longer trembling. His eyes burned with desperation. "I made a mistake. I was wrong. Take me back, Valentina, please. We can fix this. I'll be better. I'll change." For a moment, silence stretched across the street. Everyone waited, holding their breath. Then Valentina shook her head slowly. "No, Richard, you don't get to break me and then beg to rebuild me. I am not your possession. I never was, and I never will be again." Her words echoed like thunder. Richard's face crumbled, the last of his pride shattering. He fell to his knees in the snow, sobbing. But Valentina turned away. She walked back into the school, her son nestled safely against her heart, leaving him behind with nothing but his regret. That day, Greyford saw more than Richard's downfall. They saw a woman rise from the ashes of humiliation to claim her dignity, her power, her future. In the weeks that followed, Valentina continued to heal. She built a life filled with love, community, and purpose. She still carried scars, memories of ice, fear, and betrayal, but those scars no longer defined her. They were proof of survival, proof of strength. One evening, as she sat rocking Gabriel to sleep by the fire, she whispered softly, "We made it, my love. We're free." The baby cooed, his tiny fingers wrapping around hers. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude. She thought of her mother, of the inheritance that had come not just in money, but in wisdom. "Strength, my child. I left you strength," and she knew she had honored that gift. The story of Valentina Carter spread far beyond Greyford. Women in nearby towns heard whispers of the teacher who defied her cruel husband, of the woman who turned humiliation into power. Her name became a symbol, her story a reminder. Silence does not mean weakness. Endurance does not mean defeat. And though Richard remained in Greyford, a shadow of the man he once was, his name carried no weight anymore. He had lost everything he thought made him powerful. Valentina had lost him, and gained herself. In the end, her message was clear, not only to Greyford, but to every woman who ever felt trapped, voiceless, or broken. A woman is never weak because she loves. She is only weak when she forgets to love herself first. And when she remembers, no one, not even the cruelest man, can take her power away. The fire in her eyes told the rest of the story. Valentina Carter was no victim. She was a survivor. She was a mother. She was free, and her new life was only just beginning.
The luxurious ballroom of the Ashworth Plaza Hotel buzzed with excitement as New York's elite gathered for the annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, while waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. Richard Montgomery, standing tall in his custom-made tuxedo, surveyed the room with cold satisfaction. At 45, he was one of the city's most powerful real estate developers, and he knew tonight would add another victory to his list. "Everything is ready for your announcement, Mr. Montgomery," his assistant Marcus whispered, handing him a glass of champagne. Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the main entrance. He was waiting for someone specific, Maria Torres, the head of housekeeping at his company's headquarters. What she didn't know was that tonight's invitation wasn't an honor but a carefully planned humiliation. "Did you make sure the press will be here?" Richard asked, checking his gold watch. "Yes, sir, all the major society columnists are present." Richard smiled, remembering how Maria had dared to stand up to him last week when he tried to cut the cleaning staff's benefits. She had marched into his office, speaking with an authority that a maid shouldn't possess, defending her team with passionate words about dignity and fair treatment. The memory made his blood boil. Nobody challenged Richard Montgomery, especially not someone who cleaned floors for a living. The invitation to tonight's gala had been his idea of teaching her a lesson. He imagined her showing up in some cheap dress from a discount store, stumbling through proper etiquette, becoming a laughingstock among the city's finest. It would remind her of her place in the world. But as the evening wore on, Maria didn't appear. Richard grew increasingly agitated, checking his watch every few minutes. The announcement of his company's new luxury development project was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and he wanted her there to witness it. The project that would demolish the community center in her neighborhood. "Sir," Marcus interrupted his thoughts, "Mr. James Wilson has arrived." Richard's head snapped up at the mention of his biggest competitor. James Wilson, owner of Wilson Industries, was a self-made billionaire known for his unpredictable business moves. The two men had been rivals for years, each trying to outmaneuver the other in New York's cutthroat real estate market. But what made Richard's jaw drop wasn't James's presence. It was the woman on his arm. There stood Maria Torres, but not as anyone had ever seen her before. She wore an elegant emerald green gown that highlighted her natural grace. Her dark hair was styled in sophisticated waves, and a simple string of pearls adorned her neck. She carried herself with quiet confidence as she and James made their way through the crowd. "That's impossible," Richard muttered, nearly spilling his champagne. James approached with Maria, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Richard, good to see you. I believe you know Maria. She's been helping me with a special project." Maria met Richard's stunned gaze with calm dignity. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery." Richard struggled to maintain his composure as other guests began to gather around them. James continued speaking, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I should thank you, Richard, for bringing such talent to my attention. When Maria presented her proposal for affordable housing combined with community services, I knew I'd found something special. She'll be heading our new community development division." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized what was happening. The community center he planned to demolish, James and Maria had outmaneuvered him. "We'll be announcing the details next week," James added. "But I wanted you to be the first to know, considering your interest in the neighborhood." Maria said nothing, but her eyes held Richard's. In them he saw not triumph or mockery, but the same quiet strength she'd shown in his office. She didn't need to humiliate him. His own actions had accomplished that. The evening continued around them, but Richard barely noticed. His perfectly planned revenge had backfired spectacularly. As he watched Maria confidently networking with the city's elite, he realized she had never needed his validation. She had earned her place at the gala not through his mocking invitation, but through her own merit. Later that night, as the party wound down, Richard stood alone by the bar, nursing his drink. He overheard snippets of conversation about Maria's innovative ideas for community development, about James Wilson's brilliance in hiring her. His plan to shame her had instead revealed his own prejudices to everyone who mattered in New York society. Maria approached him as she was leaving. "Mr. Montgomery," she said softly, "I want you to know that the community center will be expanding its services. We'll be offering job training programs, including courses in business ethics." She paused, then added, "You're welcome to visit anytime." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard to contemplate how his attempt to put someone in their place had revealed exactly where everyone stood, and it wasn't where he had thought. The morning after the gala, Montgomery's office buzzed with nervous energy. His employees could sense his dark mood from the moment he stormed through the lobby. Inside his corner office, he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what it takes," he barked into the phone. "Find out everything about Maria Torres. There has to be something we can use." His secretary, Linda, entered cautiously with his morning coffee. After 20 years working for Richard, she knew when trouble was brewing. She had watched the security footage from last night. Everyone in the building was talking about Maria's spectacular appearance at the gala. "Your son David is here to see you," Linda announced quietly. Richard waved her away, but David was already walking in. At 32, David Montgomery was everything his father wasn't. Compassionate, humble, and more interested in helping people than making money. Their relationship had been strained ever since David chose to become a public defender instead of joining the family business. "Dad, we need to talk about what you tried to do to Maria," David said, closing the door behind him. "I don't have time for one of your moral lectures," Richard snapped, finally sitting down at his desk. "She was my friend in college, did you know that?" David's words made Richard freeze. "We took night classes together while she worked as a housekeeper to put herself through school. She graduated top of her class." Richard's face reddened. "You knew about this?" "I knew she worked here, yes. And I knew about her plans for the community center because I helped her develop them." David's voice was calm, but firm. "What I didn't know was that my own father would try to humiliate someone, just because they challenged him." Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. Linda's voice came through the intercom. "Sir James Wilson is on line 1. He says it's urgent." Richard grabbed the phone, putting it on speaker out of habit. James's confident voice filled the room. "Richard, I hope you've had time to process last night's events. I'm calling because Maria suggested we might be able to work together on the community development project." "Work together?" Richard's voice dripped with skepticism. "Yes. She believes your expertise in luxury development could help us create a mixed-income housing model that would benefit everyone. The woman you tried to embarrass is actually advocating for you to be part of the project." David watched his father's face as the words sank in. For the first time in years, he saw something crack in Richard's carefully maintained facade. "Think about it," James continued. "Maria will be presenting the full proposal at next week's city council meeting. I hope you'll be there." After James hung up, silence filled the office. David stepped closer to his father's desk. "You know, Dad, Mom always said your biggest problem was that you forgot where you came from. Grandpa was a janitor who worked nights, so you could go to business school." Richard's hands tightened on his desk. The mention of his father, a proud man who had indeed worked as a janitor, hit home in a way nothing else could have. "I need some time to think," Richard said quietly. David nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Maria's morning. Business ethics class starts at 9 tomorrow. I'll be there, as a volunteer teacher. You know where to find us if you want to see what real success looks like." Throughout the day, Richard couldn't focus on work. He kept thinking about his father, about David's words, about Maria's dignified behavior at the gala. By late afternoon, he found himself driving to his childhood neighborhood, something he hadn't done in years. The old community center was still there, its brick walls now covered in colorful murals. Children played basketball in the court, where he had spent countless hours as a boy. Through the windows, he could see people in a classroom, hunched over books. A woman was tending to a small garden in front of the building. She looked up as he approached. It was Mrs. Chen, who had run the center since Richard was a child. She had aged, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Richard Montgomery," she said, straightening up. "It's been a long time." "Mrs. Chen." He felt like a boy again, under her steady gaze. So you're still here? Someone needs to keep this place running, though I hear big changes are coming. She gestured to the building. Maria tells me it might become something even better. You know Maria? Mrs. Chen smiled. She reminds me of another, ambitious young person who used to spend every free hour here, dreaming of making it big. She paused, looking at him meaningfully. Though somewhere along the way, that person forgot that success isn't just about how high you climb. It's about reaching back to help others up. Richard stood there, memories washing over him. He remembered studying in these rooms because his apartment was too cold, remembered Mrs. Chen bringing him soup when she knew things were tight at home, remembered the day he got his college acceptance letter and how everyone in the center had celebrated. The center's having a community dinner tonight, Mrs. Chen said, turning back to her garden. 7 o'clock. Maria will be there discussing her plans with the neighbors. You might learn something if you come, just like old times. As the sun began to set, Richard sat in his car, staring at the center's entrance. People were starting to arrive for the dinner, carrying dishes, greeting each other with hugs. He saw Maria helping an elderly man up the steps, saw David arriving with a stack of papers under his arm. For the first time in years, Richard Montgomery felt uncertain about where he stood and where he wanted to stand. Richard sat in his car until the sky turned dark purple, watching people enter the community center. His phone buzzed repeatedly, urgent business calls, his assistant trying to reach him about tomorrow's meetings, but he ignored them all. Finally, gathering his courage, he stepped out of the car. The smell of home-cooked food hit him as soon as he opened the center's door. The main room had been transformed with long tables covered in mismatched tablecloths. Children ran between the tables while adults chatted and served food. For a moment, Richard felt completely out of place in his expensive suit. Well, look who decided to join us, Mrs. Chen said, appearing beside him with a paper plate. The lasagna is excellent. Maria made it herself. Before Richard could respond, he heard his son's voice. David was standing at the front of the room with Maria, pinning large drawings to a bulletin board. They were architectural plans, Richard realized, designs for the new community center. People began gathering around as Maria started to speak. These are just preliminary ideas, she said, her voice warm and clear. We want everyone's input because this center belongs to all of us. Richard moved closer, trying to blend into the crowd. But in a room where everyone knew each other, he stood out like a sore thumb. Heads turned, whispers started, until Maria noticed him. Instead of showing surprise or anger, she smiled. Mr. Montgomery, perfect timing. Would you like to share your expertise? After all, you know more about development projects than anyone here. The room went quiet. Richard felt dozens of eyes on him, including Mrs. Chen's knowing gaze and his son's hopeful look. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. I'd be happy to look at the plans, he said. For the next hour, Richard found himself drawn into detailed discussions about the project. Maria's plans were impressive. She had thought of everything from childcare facilities to job training classrooms to a rooftop garden. But she had also identified potential problems that his experience could help solve. See this support wall? He pointed out. If we move it 3 feet, you could add another classroom without increasing the budget. Maria's eyes lit up. She grabbed a marker and started making notes while others crowded around to see. The tension in the room gradually dissolved as people got caught up in the excitement of planning. During a break, Richard found himself in line for coffee next to an elderly man he recognized, Mr. Patterson, who had been his math teacher at the center 40 years ago. Never thought I'd see you back here, Richard, Mr. Patterson said, stirring sugar into his cup. So you were always in such a hurry to leave this neighborhood behind. Richard felt shame color his cheeks. I thought success meant getting as far away as possible. And now? Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. Before Richard could answer, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. James Wilson had arrived, bringing with him a team of people carrying laptops and folders. Sorry I'm late, James announced. But I brought good news. The City Council has agreed to fast-track our permit applications. Cheers erupted around the room. Richard watched as Maria hugged James in celebration, then turned to hug David. The sight of their happiness made something shift inside him. James spotted Richard and made his way over. "I hoped you'd be here," he said quietly. "Look, Richard, I know we've been rivals for years, but this project, it's bigger than our competition. Maria helps me see that. She seems to help everyone see things differently," Richard admitted. "The thing is," James continued, "we really could use your help. Maria's right. Your experience would be invaluable. But it has to be genuine. No games, no ulterior motives." Richard looked around the room. He saw Mrs. Chen serving food to young children who looked just like he had 40 years ago. He saw David laughing with community members, completely at ease in a way he never was at Richard's corporate events. He saw Maria moving from table to table, making sure everyone's voice was heard. "Can I tell you something, James?" Richard's voice was low. "When I invited Maria to that gala, I thought I was going to teach her a lesson. Instead, she's teaching all of us. That's why I hired her," James smiled. "She sees the best in people, even when they don't see it in themselves." As the evening went on, Richard found himself drawn into more conversations. He learned that the teenager serving drinks was studying for his college entrance exams, just like Richard had done here. The woman who brought 3 different desserts was starting a catering business through the center's small business program. Every person had a story, a dream, a connection to this place. Near the end of the night, Maria approached him. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and thank you for your suggestions about the plans. They'll really help." "Maria, I owe you an apology," Richard started, but she held up her hand. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Montgomery. If you're really sorry, show it by helping us make this project work." David joined them, carrying architectural plans. "Dad, we're having another planning meeting tomorrow morning. Will you be there?" Richard looked between his son and Maria, seeing the challenge and hope in their eyes. He thought about his father, about his own journey from this neighborhood to the top of New York real estate. He thought about what success really meant. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll be there. And I might have some ideas about additional funding." As he drove home that night, Richard passed the gleaming towers he had built throughout the city. For the first time, he wondered if his next building could be something different, something that would make his father proud, something that would help bridge the gap between the world he had come from and the world he had built for himself. The next morning brought chaos to Montgomery Developments. News had spread quickly through New York's business circles that Richard Montgomery was collaborating with his longtime rival, James Wilson. Reporters camped outside the building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had built his reputation on ruthless competition. But Richard wasn't in his office. Instead, he sat in a folding chair at the community center, his suit jacket draped over the back, sleeves rolled up as he pored over building plans with Maria and the project team. "If we adjust the zoning application," he explained, drawing on the blueprints, "we can add affordable housing units without sacrificing the community spaces." Maria watched him with a mixture of surprise and appreciation. This was a different Richard Montgomery from the man who had tried to humiliate her at the gala. As they worked, his phone kept ringing. Calls from board members demanding explanations, from investors worried about the company's direction. "Maybe you should take one of those calls," Maria suggested after the 5th interruption. "Your business is important too." Richard shook his head. "For the first time in years, I'm doing something that matters more than stock prices." But the outside world wouldn't wait forever. Linda, his secretary, burst into the room, looking flustered. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an emergency board meeting in an hour. They're talking about removing you as CEO." The room fell silent. David, who had been discussing plans with community members, approached his father's chair. "Dad, you can't lose the company. Not over this." Richard stood slowly, gathering his papers. The weight of his position, of all he'd built, settled back on his shoulders. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. As he headed for the door, Maria called after him. "Remember why you came back here, Mr. Montgomery. Sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards." The Montgomery Developments boardroom was packed when Richard arrived. Board members in expensive suits muttered among themselves, falling silent as he entered. At the head of the table sat Victor Sterling, the company's largest shareholder, and Richard's mentor from his early days. "Richard," Victor's voice was cold, "would you care to explain why you're throwing away 30 years of business strategy to play charity worker with James Wilson?" Richard straightened his tie and took his place at the table. He could feel the judgment, the disapproval radiating from every corner. These were people who had always followed his lead, who had celebrated his most cutthroat decisions. "Let me tell you a story," Richard began, "about a janitor's son who studied at a community center because his home had no heat, about people who believed in him when he had nothing to offer but determination." He pulled out the building plans, spreading them across the polished boardroom table. "This isn't charity. This is innovation. Mixed-income housing with integrated community services. Job training programs that create a skilled workforce. Small business incubators that grow the local economy. And how does this benefit our shareholders?" Someone demanded. "Tax incentives, government grants, positive press coverage that money can't buy. But more importantly," Richard's voice grew stronger, "it creates sustainable communities that support all our developments. When we lift people up, the whole city rises." Victor leaned forward. "You're asking us to gamble the company's reputation on a project run by a woman who was cleaning offices just weeks ago." "No," Richard countered. "I'm asking you to invest in a Harvard Business School graduate who worked as a housekeeper to put herself through college, who developed a business model that James Wilson, the smartest developer I know, recognized as revolutionary." The room buzzed with whispers. Richard pulled up financial projections on the screen, walking the board through the numbers. As he spoke, he saw expressions changing, saw the moment when business instincts began to overcome prejudice. "There's one more thing," he added. "I'm pledging 20% of my personal shares as guarantee for this project. That's how much I believe in it." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Victor stood up, demanding order. "You can't be serious, Richard. That's worth millions." "I've spent my life building towers that scrape the sky," Richard replied. "Now I want to build something that reaches people." Hours later, Richard returned to the community center. The planning team was still there, working under fluorescent lights. Maria looked up as he entered. "How did it go?" Richard loosened his tie. "The board approved the project, but they had one condition. They want you to present the full proposal at next week's shareholder meeting." Maria's eyes widened. "Me? They need to see what I saw last night. A leader who can bridge worlds and bring people together." He paused. "Will you do it?" Before Maria could answer, David burst in, waving his phone. "Have you seen the news? The stories everywhere. Real estate titan returns. To Roots pioneers social impact development," the mayor's office just called. "They want to fast-track all the permits." Maria sat down heavily. "This is happening so fast." "Welcome to the big leagues," Richard smiled. "But don't worry, you've got a pretty good team behind you now." As they gathered around the plans again, Mrs. Chen appeared with coffee and sandwiches. "You all need to eat," she insisted. "Can't change the world on an empty stomach." Richard accepted a sandwich, remembering countless other nights when Mrs. Chen had fed him while he studied. Now here he was again in the same room, planning a different kind of future. "You know," Mrs. Chen said quietly to him, "your father would be proud, not of the towers or the money, but of this moment right here." Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars. Inside the old community center, a small group of people from very different worlds worked together, drawing up plans for something new, a bridge between what was and what could be. The week leading up to the shareholder meeting passed in a blur of activity. Maria practically lived at the community center, rehearsing her presentation while juggling the demands of the project. Richard found himself spending more time there than at his office, watching with growing admiration as she mastered the complexities of large-scale development. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Rebecca Sterling, Victor's daughter and head of the company's legal department, had been watching the situation with growing concern. She had always expected to marry Richard and eventually control Montgomery Developments. Now those plans were in jeopardy. "Daddy," she complained to Victor over lunch at their exclusive club, "Richard's lost his mind. This project will ruin everything we've built." Victor sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. "Maybe not. The numbers actually look good, and the publicity has been incredible. It's not about the numbers. Rebecca slammed her hand on the table, drawing stares from nearby diners. It's about that woman. Haven't you seen how he looks at her? Indeed, others had noticed too. The growing warmth between Richard and Maria hadn't escaped anyone's attention, least of all David's. He watched his father transform day by day, becoming more like the man he remembered from his childhood, someone who cared about more than just money. The morning of the shareholder meeting, Maria arrived early at Montgomery Developments. The security guard, who just months ago had watched her clean offices, now escorted her to the executive floor. She wore a simple but elegant navy suit, carrying a folder of presentation materials. Richard was waiting in the conference room, reviewing last-minute details. "Ready for the big day?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Maria replied, but her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. "You know this project better than anyone," Richard reassured her. "Just tell them your story." "Our story." The room began filling with shareholders, board members, and executives. Rebecca Sterling swept in, wearing an outfit that cost more than Maria's monthly salary, and took a seat directly in front's view. Just as the meeting was about to begin, there was a commotion at the door. Mrs. Chen walked in, followed by Mr. Patterson and several other community members. James Wilson accompanied them, grinning at Richard's surprised expression. "Hope you don't mind," James said. "Thought the shareholders should meet some of the people this project will actually affect." Richard nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "Please take a seat." Maria stood at the podium facing the crowd. For a moment she felt the weight of all she represented. Every person who had ever been underestimated, every dream that seemed too big, every barrier that needed breaking. "Good morning," she began. "I could show you market projections and profit forecasts, but first I want to tell you about a place where dreams are born." For the next hour, Maria wove together stories and statistics, passion and pragmatism. She showed how the community center had launched countless careers, including Richard's. She demonstrated how their new model could revolutionize urban development while delivering strong returns. The room sat spellbound. Even Rebecca found herself leaning forward, caught up in Maria's vision. When Maria finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Victor Sterling stood up first. "Miss Torres, I owe you an apology. When Richard first proposed this project, I thought he had lost his business sense. Now I see he may have finally found it." Questions flew from all directions. Maria handled each one with grace and knowledge, but it was her authenticity that truly won them over. These hardened business people recognized something rare, someone who could transform lives while building profits. As the meeting wound down, Rebecca approached Maria. Her face was tight with controlled emotion. "That was impressive," she admitted grudgingly. "But don't think this changes everything. Some of us have worked our whole lives to be where you are." Maria met her gaze steadily. "Then you understand exactly how hard I've worked to be here." 2. Later that evening, the community center hosted a celebration. The project had received unanimous shareholder approval, along with additional funding offers from impressed investors. The old building hummed with joy and music. Richard found Maria sitting quietly in the library corner, away from the party. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected him. "All of us together." He sat down beside her, looking at the books lining the shelves. "You know, I used to hide in this corner when things got tough at home. Books were my escape." "They were mine too," Maria smiled. "Still are sometimes." "Maria," Richard turned to face her, "I need to tell you something. These past weeks working with you, But before he could finish, David burst in. "Dad, Maria, come quick, there's a problem." They rushed to follow him. In the main room, Rebecca Sterling stood with a team of lawyers. Her face wore a triumphant expression as she held up a stack of papers. "I'm sorry to interrupt the party," she announced loudly, "but there's something everyone needs to know about this project, and about Maria Torres." The room fell silent as Rebecca held up the documents. Mrs. Chen moved protectively closer to Maria, while Richard stepped forward to face Rebecca. "Whatever you're doing, Rebecca, think carefully," Richard warned. Rebecca's smile widened. "Oh, I've thought carefully, very carefully. She turned to address the crowded room. Did anyone bother to check Miss Torres's background before handing her control of a multi-million-dollar project? I did, James Wilson spoke up from the back. Thoroughly. Really. Rebecca started passing out copies of her documents. Then, you know about Sterling Heights? Maria's face went pale. Richard watched her reaction with concern while confused murmurs spread through the room. Sterling Heights was a low-income housing project in Chicago, Rebecca continued. 5 years ago it collapsed during construction. The development company went bankrupt. And who was the junior project manager? She pointed dramatically at Maria. Maria Torres. Gasps filled the room. David moved to stand beside Maria, putting a supportive hand on her shoulder. That's not the whole story, Maria said quietly. No? Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you changed your name afterward. It was Maria Torres then, with a Z. I have the paperwork. Right here. That's enough, Richard's voice boomed through the room. But Maria touched his arm gently. No, it's time everyone knew the truth. Maria walked to the center of the room, facing the crowd of people who had become her friends and supporters. Yes, I was involved with Sterling Heights. I was 24, just out of college, eager to make a difference. The company hired me because they wanted someone from the community to be their face, to convince people to trust them. She took a deep breath before continuing. 3 months into the project, I discovered they were using substandard materials, violating safety codes. I reported it to the city inspectors and testified against the company owners. The project was shut down before anyone could get hurt. And yes, I changed the spelling of my name, not to hide, but because I was receiving threats from the people I'd exposed. Mrs. Chen walked up and took Maria's hand. You didn't just report them, she said. You helped the families who had already invested their savings find new homes. You worked 3 jobs to help pay them back, even though it wasn't your fault. Rebecca's triumphant expression faltered. This wasn't the scandal she'd expected to uncover. James Wilson cleared his throat. That's actually why I hired you, Maria. Not just because of your business plan, but because when I looked into your background, I found a person of extraordinary integrity. But she changed her name, Rebecca protested. She hid her past. Like you changed yours? Richard's quiet question silenced the room. Wasn't it Rebecca Steinberg before your father married into the Sterling family? Rebecca's face flushed red. Victor Sterling stood up, looking uncomfortable. Richard? That's not relevant. Isn't it? Richard moved to stand beside Maria. We all have parts of our past we've tried to leave behind. The difference is what we do with our second chances. David stepped forward, holding up his phone. While everyone's sharing truths, here's another one. I just got off the phone with the Chicago Housing Authority. They've been trying to reach Maria for months, the families from Sterling Heights. They've created a community fund with the settlement. Money they finally received. They want Maria to help them build something new. Tears filled Maria's eyes. I never knew what happened to them. After the court case, I couldn't... They never forgot how you fought for them, David said softly. Rebecca looked around the room, realizing her plan had backfired. Instead of destroying Maria's credibility, she had only strengthened it. In desperation, she turned to her father. Daddy, you can't let this happen. The company will be in excellent hands, Victor finished firmly. Better hands than when we tried to hide our own humble beginnings. He walked over to Maria. My father was a tailor who changed our name from Steinberg to Sterling because he thought it sounded more American. I've spent so long trying to forget that I almost forgot what really matters. The tension in the room began to dissolve. People gathered around Maria, not to condemn her but to express admiration for her courage. Rebecca stood alone, watching her carefully constructed world shift on its axis. Richard approached her quietly. You know, Rebecca, there's room for everyone in this new vision, if you're willing to be part of it. She stared at him for a long moment, then at Maria, who was now surrounded by well-wishers. I need some time to think. As Rebecca left, the celebration gradually resumed. But something had changed. The truth had made everyone's commitment to the project stronger, more personal. Later that night, Richard found Maria in the library corner again. This time, she was looking at old photographs on the wall. Pictures of community center graduates who had gone on to better lives. "I've spent 5 years trying to make up for Sterling Heights," she said without turning around. "Trying to prove I could make a real difference." "You have," Richard replied. "Not just here, but in all of us." He paused. "You know, I never finished what I was trying to tell you earlier." Maria turned to face him. "About that, Richard, there's something else you should know. Something about your father." Before she could continue, Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway. "Maria, there's a call from Chicago. The families, they're on a video chat. They want to talk to you." Maria hesitated, torn between the past calling her back and the future standing before her. Richard smiled encouragingly. "Go," he said. "Some conversations need to happen in their own time." As Maria hurried away, Richard watched her go, feeling both hopeful and uneasy. What could she possibly know about his father, and how would it affect everything they were building together? The next morning, Richard arrived at the community center earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well, Maria's words about his father echoing in his mind. He found Mrs. Chen already there, watering the small indoor plants that lined the windows. "You're here early," she remarked, studying his face. "Trouble sleeping?" "What do you know about my father?" Richard asked directly. "What does Maria know?" Mrs. Chen set down her watering can. "Some stories need to be told by the right person at the right time." Before Richard could press further, Maria walked in. She looked tired but happy, carrying a stack of papers and a worn leather notebook he'd never seen before. "The Chicago families stayed up half the night sharing their stories," she said. "They've been doing amazing things with their community fund." Then she noticed the tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" "Tell him," Mrs. Chen said gently. "It's time." Maria nodded slowly. "Let's sit down. This might take a while." They settled in the library corner. Maria opened the leather notebook, and Richard recognized his father's handwriting. His heart began to pound. "When I first started working here as a housekeeper," Maria began, "I found this behind some old books. It's your father's journal from when he worked here as a janitor. He wrote about his dreams for you for this place." As she handed Richard the notebook, his hands trembled as he opened it. "But there's more," Maria continued. "Your father didn't just clean this building. He was one of its founders." Richard looked up sharply. "That's impossible. My father was just a janitor. He barely made enough to support us." "By day, yes," Mrs. Chen joined in. "But at night, he and my husband worked together. They saw how many people in the neighborhood needed help. A safe place to study, job training, childcare. They started small, just one room in the basement." Richard began reading the journal entries. His father's words painted a picture so different from the quiet, tired man he remembered. "Tonight, we helped 10 people fill out job applications. Miguel's daughter got into college, first in her family. This place is becoming what we dreamed. Someday Richard will understand that true success isn't in what you take, but in what you give back." "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Richard's voice cracked. "He tried," Mrs. Chen said softly. "Remember those nights he wanted you to stay and help, with the evening programs? But you were always rushing off to business meetings, climbing that corporate ladder." Maria touched Richard's arm gently. "There's something else you need to see." She pulled out an old photograph from between the journal's pages. It showed a group of people standing proudly in front of the center. Richard's father stood in the center, younger and smiling, holding a plaque. "This was taken the day the center got its first major grant," Maria explained. "Your father wrote about it. He used his janitorial job at different companies to make connections, convinced business owners to invest in the community. He was building bridges long before any of us." Richard stared at the photo, memories flooding back. The nights his father came home late, not just tired from cleaning but energized despite the hour. The proud look in his eyes that Richard had always mistaken for simple fatigue. The way he tried to talk about the center, about community, about what really mattered. "The night he died," Richard said slowly, "he asked me to come here, said he had something important to tell me. But I was too busy. Had a big merger meeting. The next day, he wanted to show you this." Mrs. Chen held up another document, a deed. "He left his shares in the center to you, not much financially, but a piece of everything he built here. The lawyer tried to contact you, but But I was too busy moving forward to look back, Richard finished. He looked around the room with new eyes, seeing his father's legacy in every corner. The door opened and David walked in, stopping short when he saw the group's serious faces. "What's going on?" "Your grandfather," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "was more than we ever knew." He handed the journal to his son. As David read, Maria quietly explained about finding the journal, about discovering the connection between her current project and the work Richard's father had done decades ago. "So that's why this place felt so right," David said wonderingly. "It's in our blood." Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The morning sun illuminated the garden outside. The same garden his father had started 40 years ago, now tended by a new generation of dreamers. "I've been so wrong," he said. "All these years I thought I was building something new, but I was just recreating his vision without even knowing it." Maria joined him at the window. "That's why this project matters so much. It's not just about building new walls, it's about continuing what your father started, building bridges between people, between worlds." "The businessman and the cleaner," Richard said softly, looking at Maria. "Just like my father, moving between worlds, seeing the value in both." Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. "Some things skip a generation. Your father would be happy to see his son finally understanding." Just then, Rebecca Sterling walked in, looking uncertain. She carried a thick folder labeled Montgomery Center Archives. I've been doing more research," she said hesitantly. "There's something else you should see about your father, Richard, about all of our fathers." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder on the library table. Everyone gathered around as she spread out yellowed newspaper clippings, old photographs and faded documents. "After last night, I couldn't sleep," she explained. "I went to the city archives, started digging into the history of this neighborhood, this center, and I found this." She pointed to a newspaper article from 1975. The headline read, "Local Workers Unite to Save Community." Below was a photograph that made Richard's breath catch. His father stood with a group of men, including a younger Victor Sterling and James Wilson's father. "They all worked here," Rebecca continued. "Your father as the janitor, my father as a bookkeeper before he changed our name, and James's father as the maintenance man. They weren't just employees, they were friends." Maria leaned in to read the article. It says they organized a fundraiser when the center was about to be shut down. They saved it together. "My father never told me," Rebecca said softly. "He always said we came from old money, that we were better than—" She stopped, looking ashamed. "Better than people like me?" Maria asked gently. "People who clean buildings and dream of something more?" Rebecca nodded, tears in her eyes. "I found my father's old journals too. He wrote about your father, Richard, called him the wisest man he knew. They used to meet here after work, planning ways to help people while keeping their day jobs." Richard picked up another photograph. In it, the three men sat at a beat-up table, sharing coffee and laughing. They looked so young, so unburdened by the weight of status and expectations. "But something happened," Rebecca continued. "There was a falling out. The papers don't say what, but after that they all went their separate ways. My father changed our name, moved us to the wealthy side of town. He never mentioned this place again." Mrs. Chen had been listening quietly. "Now," she spoke up, "I remember that time. Your fathers had different ideas about how to help people. Victor, Mr. Sterling, wanted to buy up properties, demolish them for new development. He said it was for the greater good. But Richard's father believed in preserving the community, helping people build from within." "And James's father?" David asked. "He tried to keep the peace," Mrs. Chen sighed. "But in the end he had to choose sides. The center stayed, but the friendship was broken." Maria touched one of the photographs thoughtfully. "So that's why this project matters so much to everyone. It's not just about building something new, it's about healing something old." "There's more," Rebecca said, pulling out a legal document. "The original deed to this property. It was jointly owned by all three men. They never dissolved the partnership. Legally, the Montgomery, Sterling, and Wilson families still share ownership of this land." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. All their recent conflicts, the competition between their companies, the social divisions they'd maintained. All of it had been built on a forgotten foundation of friendship and shared purpose. Richard sat down heavily, holding his father's journal. All these years, we've been fighting over who could build the biggest towers, make the most money. And right here under our feet was the real legacy they wanted us to continue. Maybe that's why our paths kept crossing, Maria suggested. Some stories need to come full circle before they can move forward. Just then, James Wilson walked in. He stopped short when he saw everyone gathered around the old documents. "James," Richard called, "there's something you need to see about your father." As James joined them, Rebecca explained her discoveries. His face showed the same mix of surprise, pain, and understanding that they had all experienced. "My father used to say that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you share," James said, quietly. I never fully understood what he meant until now. David had been studying the legal documents. "You know what this means? The new project, it's not just a collaboration, it's a reunion. We're finally finishing what they started." Maria looked around at these people who had become so much more than colleagues. "But this time, we're doing it together. No more choosing sides." Rebecca stood up straighter, wiping her eyes. "I need to tell my father about this. He should know, so we all should know where we really came from." "We'll go together," Richard decided. "All of us. It's time to bridge more than just neighborhoods." Mrs. Chen watched them with satisfaction. "Your fathers used to sit in this very room, sharing dreams over coffee. Now here you all are, finally understanding what they tried to teach you." As if on cue, the morning sun broke through the windows, illuminating the old photographs. 3. Young men smiled up from the past, their friendship preserved in faded color, their dreams waiting to be rediscovered by their children. "You know what this means?" David picked up the original deed. "Legally, none of our companies can move forward with any plans without all three families agreeing." "Maybe that's exactly what our fathers wanted," James suggested. "To make sure that someday we'd have to work together again." Maria touched Richard's arm gently. "Like your father wrote, true success isn't in what you take, but in what you give back." As they gathered the documents, making plans to visit Victor Sterling together, Richard noticed something else fall from his father's journal, a sealed envelope with his name on it, in his father's handwriting. The paper was aged, but the seal was intact. His hands trembling slightly, Richard picked up the letter that had waited so many years to be read. The room grew quiet as Richard held the envelope. His father's familiar handwriting brought back a flood of memories. Homework, checked at the kitchen table, birthday cards, the last note he'd left saying he was working late at the center. "That was the night he died. Do you want us to leave?" Maria asked softly. Richard shook his head. "No. Whatever's in here, I think we're all meant to hear it." With careful fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed pages. His father's words written decades ago filled the paper. "My dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back to the center, back to the truth about our family's legacy. I've tried to tell you so many times, but you were always running towards something else, something bigger. Maybe that's my fault. I wanted you to have more than I did, but somewhere along the way, I failed to show you what more really means. You. See, this center isn't just a building. It's a promise we made, Victor, James Sr. and I. We came from nothing, worked whatever jobs we could find, but we shared a dream of making life better for our community. Victor kept the books, James fixed what was broken, and I kept it all clean and running. We were the night shift dreamers, planning a better future while the rest of the world slept. The night we signed the deed, we made a pact. No matter what happened, this place would stand as a bridge between worlds, helping people cross from where they are to where they dream of being. We promised our children would know the value of both sides of that bridge. But dreams have a way of changing people. Victor started seeing dollar signs instead of faces. He talked about progress that pushed people out instead of lifting them up. The night it all fell apart, he brought developers here, planned to sell the center for a luxury project. James Sr. and I couldn't let that happen. We had promised too many people a place to build their dreams. The fight that followed broke more than our friendship. It broke our shared vision. Victor took his business skills and built his empire. James Sr. focused on his family and his honest work. And I stayed here, keeping the lights on, watching you grow up and wondering if I'd failed to give you the most important inheritance, the understanding that true wealth isn't in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives you touch. But I never lost hope. I kept this letter and the deed safe, believing that someday you would find your way back. That someday you would understand why I chose to remain a janitor, even when Victor offered me a corporate job, why I spent my evenings teaching adults to read instead of chasing promotions. If you're reading this now, look around you. Every corner of this place holds someone's dream. The study room where single mothers earn their degrees while their children sleep nearby. The workshop where laid-off workers learn new trades. The garden where seniors teach young people about patience and growth. This is the real skyline of our city. Not the towers that scrape the clouds, but the bridges we build between people. I don't know what kind of man you've become, my son. But I hope you're reading this because something led you back here. Back to the truth about what success really means. The deed you've discovered isn't just a legal document. It's a second chance. For you, for Victor's child, for James's son. A chance to rebuild not just buildings, but the bridges between worlds that we once dreamed of. There's a quote your mother loved. "We rise by lifting others." She understood better than anyone that real power isn't in how high you climb, but in how many people you bring with you. I'm leaving you my shares in this center, not because they're worth money, but because they're worth everything that matters. What you do with this legacy is your choice. But remember, the greatest towers mean nothing if they cast shadows over people's dreams. With hope and love, your father. Richard's voice broke as he finished reading. The room was silent, except for quiet sniffles, Rebecca wiping away tears, David trying to maintain composure, Mrs. Chen nodding with remembered wisdom. Maria touched the letter gently. He knew. Somehow he knew that someday you'd all find your way back here. Not just us, Richard said, looking at her. People like you, too. People who understand both sides of the bridge he talked about. James picked up one of the old photographs. Our fathers weren't just business partners. They were trying to show us a different way of measuring success. And we almost missed it, Rebecca added softly. Too busy fighting over who owned the skyline to see the foundation they built. Mrs. Chen stood up, her face determined. Well, you see it now. The question is, what will you do with this understanding? Before anyone could answer, Linda burst into the room, her face pale with urgency. Richard, you need to turn on the news now. David grabbed his phone, pulling up a news live stream. The headline made everyone gasp. Breaking, Victor Sterling suffers heart attack during emergency board meeting. Rebecca's knees buckled. Richard caught her before she fell. We need to get to the hospital, she whispered. We'll all go, Maria decided, already gathering their coats. As they rushed out, Richard carefully folded his father's letter and put it in his pocket, next to his heart. The weight of it felt like a compass, finally pointing him in the right direction. In the elevator, Rebecca gripped Richard's hand. Dad was going to announce something big at that board meeting. Something about the center, about making things right. Then we'll make sure he gets the chance, Richard promised, watching the floors tick down. Outside, the city sparkled in the morning sun. Somewhere between the towers and shadows, bridges waited to be built, just as 3 night shift dreamers had imagined so long ago. The hospital waiting room buzzed with tension as doctors worked to stabilize Victor Sterling. Rebecca paced nervously while Richard, Maria, and James sat together, the weight of their father's letter still fresh in their minds. He was trying to tell me something this morning, Rebecca said, stopping her pacing. He called, wanted to meet, before the board meeting, but I was too busy preparing legal documents for fighting us, Richard finished gently. We've all been too busy fighting. A doctor emerged from the emergency room and everyone stood up. Mr. Sterling is stable, she announced. He's asking for his daughter and Richard Montgomery. Rebecca. And Richard exchanged glances before following the doctor. In the hospital room, Victor looked smaller somehow, vulnerable against the white sheets. His eyes opened as they approached. The letter, he said weakly. You found it? Richard blinked in surprise. You knew about it? Of course I knew. Victor's voice grew stronger. Your father showed it to me years ago, made me promise to help you find your way back when the time was right. That's what I was going to announce today, returning the Sterling family's shares of the center back to the community trust. Rebecca gasped. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, Victor admitted. I let greed change me, hurt the best friends I ever had. But watching you all these past weeks, seeing the center coming back to life, I knew it was time. Meanwhile, in the waiting room, Maria sat with Mrs. Chen, who had arrived bringing coffee for everyone. You know, Mrs. Chen said, Richard's father wasn't the only one who left a letter. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 more envelopes, aged just like Richard's father's letter. James Sr. and Victor left these too. They made me promise to keep them safe until they were needed. James took his father's letter with trembling hands. Like Richard's, it told a story of friendship, dreams, and hope for the future. Victor's letter, which Mrs. Chen saved for Rebecca, contained a confession and a plea for forgiveness. When Richard and Rebecca returned to the waiting room, their faces showed both relief and purpose. Dad's going to be okay, Rebecca announced, and there's something we need to do. 1 month later, the community center buzzed with excitement. Television crews set up their equipment as people filled every available seat. On stage, photographs of 3 young men were displayed prominently. Richard's father, James Sr., and Victor, in their days as the night shift dreamers. Richard stood at the podium, Maria by his side, while Rebecca, James, and David sat with Victor, who had insisted on leaving the hospital for this moment. 30 years ago, 3 men had a dream, Richard began. They believed that success wasn't measured by how high you could climb, but by how many people you could lift up with you. Today, we're not just honoring their dream, we're expanding it. He gestured to the architectural plans displayed behind him. The new Montgomery Sterling Wilson Community Development Trust will transform not just this neighborhood, but our entire approach to urban development. Every luxury project we build will fund community programs. Every new tower will create opportunities for education, job training, and small business support. Maria stepped forward. We're not just building buildings, we're building bridges. Between communities, between opportunities, between dreams. Rebecca joined them, her voice strong with conviction. The Sterling Foundation is dedicating its resources to support scholarship programs, ensuring that everyone has the chance to rise. James stood next. And Wilson Industries will provide job training and employment opportunities, creating real pathways to success. Victor struggled to his feet, supported by David. We lost our way once, he said, his voice carrying despite its weakness. But our children found it back. Today we're rebuilding more than buildings. We're rebuilding faith in the idea that everyone deserves a chance to succeed. As applause filled the room, Mrs. Chen watched from the back, tears in her eyes. Beside her, Sarah, one of the center's cleaning staff, watched in wonder. Do you think I could ever? Sarah started to ask. Take these, Mrs. Chen handed her some college applications. Maria already set up a scholarship fund for staff members who want to study. Your dream starts now. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Richard found Maria in their usual spot in the library corner. You know, he said, I never did finish what I was trying to tell you that night. Maria smiled. About how you've fallen in love with me. Richard looked surprised, and she laughed. I'm good at reading between the lines. It's a skill you develop. When you clean offices, you learn to see what's really important. And what do you see now? Richard asked softly. I see a man who found his way back to his father's dream, she replied. A man who finally understands that love, like success, isn't about power or position. It's about lifting each other up. Their kiss was interrupted by David calling them excitedly. You need to see this. In the main hall, Victor had gathered everyone around. He stood with Rebecca and James, their father's letters in hand. These letters weren't just about the past, Victor announced. They were about the future. Each of us wrote about our dreams for our children and for this place. And at the end of each letter was a key. He held up an old brass key, matching ones held by James and Richard. We never knew what they were for, Victor continued, until today. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, holding an ancient-looking strongbox. They brought this here the night they signed the original deed, she explained. Said it wasn't to be opened until their children found their way back to each other. The 3 keys fit perfectly. Inside, they found photographs, documents, and a handwritten message signed by all 3 men. To our children, when they finally understand, the true legacy of success is not in what you own, but in what you share. Only together can we build bridges strong enough to hold everyone's dreams. Love, Dad? The room fell silent as the message sank in. Then Sarah's voice rang out from the back. My college application is approved. I got a scholarship. Cheers erupted. Again. Richard held Maria close, watching his father's dream unfold in real time. Rebecca hugged her father, tears of joy replacing old regrets. James and David started discussing plans for the next phase of development. Outside, the city skyline stretched toward the clouds. But now, among the towers of steel and glass, new bridges were being built. Invisible but stronger than concrete, connecting dreams to reality, past to future, heart to heart. Mrs. Chen stood in her usual spot by the window, tending to her plants. Your fathers would be proud, she said to no one in particular. They always said love was the strongest foundation. As the sun set over the city, the community center glowed with light and life. Inside its walls, the past and future had finally met, and a new story was just beginning.